Excellent. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had a nice break, and my pleasure to introduce our next speaker in today's session. So we are joined by Emilio Vavarella. He is a PhD student, and we're extremely lucky to have him here in our Film and Visual Studies PhD program. He's also part of our critical media practice study here. He is a professional artist. He's been showing his work for about the last 10 years in places throughout Italy, including some of Rome's biggest museums, as well as in Bologna. He's had some fantastic shows in London, so you can see his work quite different places. He's been thinking about ways that technology has been impacting how we think about ourselves and we think about the world. And it's a real pleasure for us to have him with us here today to talk to us a little bit about some of his projects. Emilio.
Thank you. Thank you for the generous introduction. And of course, thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here. Yeah, as the introduction said, I work a lot with technology. I'm very passionate on what is our relationship with technology, how technology impacts our lives. And I've been really focusing on different artistic strategies to deal with technology for the past 10 years. And this is pretty much what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to discuss 4 different projects from 4 different moments in my artistic path, 4 projects that deal with 4 different technologies, which are facial recognition technology, artificial intelligence, and Google Street View, so digital mapping. And then the last project will be about genotyping. So this idea of translating our genetic information into a code, or even thinking about life in terms of information. As I will talk about these different technologies, I will also discuss 4 different ways of approaching technology from an artistic vantage point. And it also occurred to me, as I was invited to give this talk, that I will be also talking about different ways of dealing from the perspective of a single person, a single artist, with large corporations. In this case, it will be Facebook, Google, and Amazon, which they are behind the technologies that I've used in my work. So without further ado, let me share my screen. Here we are. I hope you can all see this. The title is Artistic Research in the Age of Technological Innovation. And so the 4 projects that I will be discussing are entitled Digital Paradolia, a personal index of Facebook's erroneous portraits. This is a project from 2012. It is one of my earliest art projects, which will be followed by a discussion of the Google Trilogy, which is a photographic series divided in 3 parts, and it deals with Google Street View and Google Mapping. The 3rd project, Amazon's Cabinet of Curiosities, will address the question of the impact of artificial intelligence, and in particular, shopping assistance on our life. And finally, my most recent project, entitled The Other Shapes of Me, which addresses the question of what happens to human life once it's understood in terms of information. So Digital Paradolia, being one of my first projects, is also a project that in its formalization artistically was done in a very simple way. The whole project was just based on me using Facebook and then taking screenshots, so photographies of my computer screen. Now, this was 2012. Facebook had just introduced in Europe it's facial recognition technology for photos. So for the first time, people were able to upload images and then you would see something like this little square here, for example, in the bottom right corner, which would automatically detect the face of a person. At the time, it was not able to pair that face with a name, something that today is possible, but it was already detecting human faces. And then it would ask you who is in this photo, and you could actually tag someone to that picture. The interesting thing that I noticed is that sometimes the facial recognition technology didn't work. And so, for example, as you can see here in this central image, the little square is highlighting a detail that is not a human face. In fact, it's just a little piece of a like little technical equipment. And I was quite interested in this idea of like what happens when facial recognition fails. And so to investigate this, I decided to upload all of the photos that I had at the time to my personal Facebook account. It was 30,000 photos, which I had collected over the course of around 7 years, from 2005 onward up to that point. And just to give you a sense of what that means in terms of what Facebook was handling, 30,000 photos at the time was the equivalent of the photos that were being uploaded to Facebook in 10 seconds. So I went through each facial recognition suggestion, and then I only selected the wrong ones, which I called the wrong portraits. And what came out of this process, this very systematic conceptual approach, was a collection of 193 wrong portraits. So portraits which are generated by a glitch in facial recognition technology. And by doing a general estimate, I could also calculate that every second, the facial recognition was failing 19 times. So of course, it is kind of just funny, little experiment at this scale, but it becomes something way more important and troublesome when we understand that we are using this technology to detect shoplifters, to identify people, and that the technology that we use is always subjected to this sort of like technical glitches. So the work was installed as a sort of like visual index where all the portraits were linked to, they were part of a diagram, and then they were linked to an index where you could read what each photo originally was, where the photo came from, and so what was the origin of this wrong portrait. Here is a detail of some of these wrong portraits. Now, like a couple of months later, I published the Google Trilogy. This was a work that occupied a large part of a full year of virtually traveling in Google Street View. And Google Street View was also at the time quite new. It was just starting to offer the possibility of visiting all of these places around the world. It gave the impression that images were now something you could travel within, not just something you would see. And also, it offered this idea of a seamless environment in which we could all move and transit from place to place. Everything was perfect within this space. You're never stuck in traffic in Google Street View. But the interesting thing was that the more I traveled, the more I discovered these very strange images you're seeing. These images are glitches where they are not caused by me. I did not alter or modify or change or produce any of these images. I simply took them. I photographed them using a screenshot, the same way that a photo reporter would travel the world and then take photos of something beautiful. And all of these images represent or show a technical error, an error in the technology of Google Street View, which reveals, in my opinion, a couple different things. It reveals both the fallibility of the technology, but it also reveals the beauty that sometimes can come out of these technical errors. And so I collected 100 photos and I collected them before these images were deleted because Google Street View is constantly updating its pool of images. People can click in the bottom left corner of each image. There is a button that says report a problem within the standard Google Street View interface. And if you report the problem, then Google, as soon as possible, will fix the image or substitute it. So my idea was that of collecting all of these images before they were gone. Here is a view of the Museum of Modern Art in Bologna, where I showed for the first time in 2018 the whole series. The second part of the trilogy is entitled Michaelis Story. I think it's interesting to show this because it shows how the same material, the same source, which is Google Street View, can be used in a completely different way by just changing the artistic approach. And for this project, I selected only details of images. I'll show you a couple. I made them all in black and white. I made them all squares. I made them all 20 by 20 centimeters. And through 100 of these fragments, I told one single story, the story of a man with whom I collaborated, a person who had been in a car crash. And my idea was that of telling his story by using fragments of images, of stories in a way, that come from all over the world. And they are repurposed and recontextualized and used in a different way. So this was my way of, in a way, reestablishing some sort of like humanity within this immense database of images that have been dehumanized. There are no personalities. There are no real people. If there are people, they are often like blurred and you don't see them. So my idea here was that of actually taking those images back and reconstructing one single human journey. And finally, the third part of the trilogy, entitled The Driver and the Cameras. For this project, I wanted to focus on something that is often hidden. It's almost a bit of a ghost presence within Google Street View, and that is the driver of the Google car. We always see the images which are produced by a Google car. We never ask who is driving the car, who is that person. So this is a characteristic of technology, which is the sort of like removal of labor. It turns labor into something invisible. And for this project, I wanted that labor, that the human side of labor in particular, to become visible and to go back to the center of our attention. So I selected 11 portraits of the drivers from the Google car. All of these portraits were also taken almost by mistake by the car, and they were almost by mistake uploaded within Google Street View. Often the drivers, they're either cleaning or they're fixing the cameras. So something happened there with the proximity of the human face to the camera. The facial recognition that usually blurs an image didn't work correctly. And these portraits basically became some sort of like virtual landscape within Google Street View. And they were there until I found them and I collected them. And this series is composed of 11 of these images, and it's the same number of lenses used on the camera that back then was installed on every Google car. Then let's jump in time to 2019 for a more recent project. This is Amazon's cabinet of Curiosities, and then there is a sort of like attached project to it, which is Amazon's Stravaganza Personal Index of Infinite Consumption. This project starts as a commission. I was asked to produce a work on artificial intelligence, and I decided to start from what I know best, which is Amazon Alexa, a very common kind of artificial intelligence, a virtual shopping assistant that has become part of our lives, at least for so many of us. And so again, using my, let's say, common strategy of adopting a conceptual approach, I approached Alexa and I asked Alexa a question. I asked Alexa, can you suggest a product for a new art project? And of course, Alexa immediately suggested one product, just a random product, which I acquired. I was given a production budget by the person who had commissioned this work. And so I acquired this product with my budget, and immediately after, Alexa suggests another product, which I also buy, and so on and so on. I keep buying every product that is suggested by the artificial intelligence until I have what we can call a cabinet of curiosities. I will show you a short video so you can see what it looked like.
Mi sono
sono relazionato con un'intelligenza artificiale che è diventata molto comune, che è Alexa, il virtual shopping assistant sviluppato da Amazon. L'opera nasce con una domanda che è anche un po' ironica e provocatoria. Questa domanda era: Alexa, mi aiuti a scegliere un prodotto per una nuova opera d'arte. Ho poi semplicemente acquistato i prodotti che l'intelligenza artificiale aveva scelto per me. Quindi l'opera si è conclusa ad esaurimento budget, e quello che si vede qui segue in realtà una logica molto precisa, che è una logica ottimizzata per un consumismo compulsivo. And here is the result. The result is this cabinet of curiosities. Cabinet of curiosities were very common, especially in the 16th and 17th century, where wealthy people in Europe would assemble these spaces by using materials, objects, artifacts, all kinds of like weird and interesting things that were being imported in Europe, both through international trade, but also colonial expeditions. And my idea here was reshaping the idea of what a cabinet of curiosities is. A cabinet of curiosities that represents, in the most precise way possible, in my opinion, the practices of the capitalist practices of consumption today. And so the entire artwork, in a way, is the product of an artificial intelligence. It is the product of the algorithms that are used by Amazon to improve or augment our consumption. But in a more subtle way, it's also my way of questioning issues of authorship. Who is really the author in a world in which we are giving so much agency to other systems that are making decisions for us? So in this case, it's not so clear who is in charge. Is it the artist or is it Alexa? But also, like, how is our aesthetic sense really being affected by our reliance on systems like Amazon? If what we buy is not what we choose, but it's only what is suggested to us, and what we like is what we see most, because that's what is suggested, it means that also our aesthetic sense is going to shift according to the algorithms that we are exposed to. So these are all questions, issues, topics that I try to address in this project in a conceptual way. Here, what you're seeing in this slideshow, it's a collection of images. As every time I get products from Amazon as part of this cabinet of curiosities, I document them, I photograph them, and then I create these photographic works, which are a sort of like index of my own consumption. And it's a parallel project, so to say. Now let's move to the final project that I want to discuss, The Other Shapes of Me. This is probably my most ambitious and technically challenging and complex project to date. This is what it looks like. This is a preview. The work that you're seeing here was installed just 2 days ago at Galleria Più in Bologna, which is my gallery, the gallery with, that I'm working with. And this is part of an exhibition that will open on May 4th. And this project, I've been working on this for several years. The idea was that of converting my entire genetic code into a textile. And the work that you're seeing here, it's composed of 3 different parts. There is this incredible piece of machinery, which is a Jacquard loom. If you have never heard about a Jacquard loom is often considered the first computer. It's a loom, so it produces textile, but it was also the first industrial machine to use punched cards, which you can see here, they're pink. And it means that it can compute binary information in order to produce a textile. So the second component of the work is the textile, which you see here. It's over 80 meters long, and it comprises all of my genetic information in the form of a textile. And finally, in the center, you have this video. I will show you a trailer of it. This video documents, although it documents, it's a bit of a reductive word, it documents the production process of this textile. And the production process, this computation of my genetic information in a textile, was done by my mother. So this is also a film about genesis and reproduction. Here you can see some images. You can see my mom at work. She, of course, has already produced my genetic code once. Here she's reproducing it again, but this time she's using a different material. And the reason why I decided to connect this idea of the genetic code with a textile machine, it's actually there is more than one reason. One reason is that our genetic code is in its essence information, and it's binary information. And the Jacquard loom was the first machine that could handle this kind of information. So here was my first like source of interest. Like, what happens if I actually take all of my genetic data and I feed it into this machine? The other point of interest was that both the history of computation and the history of textiles have a very strong component in the history of human labor. So that's why I wanted also to involve my mother in order to explore these gender issues and this sort of like hidden history of technological development, where the word computer was first used to describe women at work. The first women that were hired to work on computers came from the textile industry. And the first algorithms was actually written by a woman, Ada Lovelace. So lots of points of contact. And the more I explored, the more I discovered that there were increasingly more points of contact. Before I highlight a couple more, I will show you a short video. It's only a couple minutes. This is the trailer of the film that is part of the installation. And the title is Genesis. I will be happy to share the link to the full film if you're interested, but this gives you a sense of the incredible production process behind this project. It was a project that involved like a lot of different kinds of expertise, not only artistic expertise, but artisanal expertise, technical expertise, and also in a way theoretical expertise. As there was so much theory that at some point it became evident to all of the people involved, which I should say, besides me, the company, cultural association that co-produced this work called Random, and the grant program Italian Council that sponsored the project, along with my gallery, the Film Studies Center at Harvard, and Culture Hub in Shanghai, and other partners that along the way joined the project. We all realized that it was very important to actually have a publication. And so this is what we did with, we put together sort of like a compendium, a small anthology, and where we asked people coming from all kinds of areas, from philosophy, bioengineering, media theory, history of science and technology, to contribute their thoughts, to intersect their work with sort of like narrative that was being produced by my installation. So if I go back quickly, you can see, for example, these photos. These come from different moments. This project itself was shown in different ways. We put together a trilogy of exhibition. The first one just focusing on the production process, but it didn't reveal what the artwork actually was. A second installation and exhibition in Shanghai, which put in context this research as part of all of my research and all of my other artworks. And finally, the exhibition that opens next week on May 4th, which reveals the final work, but also presents some new works, like these ones on the upper left, which are called sections. And they are sections of my DNA produced with a different loom, not the 19th century loom, but a digital contemporary loom. So now I'm exploring also different ways of using the same source material, which is my genetic code, and transforming it into different things. I think I'm just at the threshold of my half an hour, so I would probably stop here, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have, but thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. Very nicely done. So we have time for some questions, and I find his work fascinating with the connections with the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier today, and would be happy to open it up to questions. Wendy, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi. I'm fascinated by your work, and in the last piece, I'm struck by the imagery and the sound and the harshness of the, the sound imagery and even the visual imagery. If your mother wasn't in it, I would notice the lack of humanity in it that you've been talking about. And how do you feel about the piece reflecting your personal identity? Because as you say, it's your DNA, but how does it relate to your identity?
Thank you, Wendy. Such a good question. I think to answer that question, I would probably need another half an hour, but there is a thread that actually connects all of the projects that I discussed. They all stem out to my personal experience. So for the first one, for example, it was all of my photos, which is in a way, our life. We take pictures to document our existence. And so 7 years worth of photos, that became the origin of the first project. For the second one, it was my own travels. 1 year of all of my virtual movements within maps. They became the other project. With Amazon was my consumption, the products that I acquired. And finally, with the fourth one, it's my genetic code. With other projects that I didn't discuss today, you would find maybe my memories or tracking my sleep and my rest and transforming that into art. There is always this idea of starting from myself, and that is my way of reintroducing humanity within these very non-human systems. the sound that you mentioned in the film, actually all of the sound that you hear, even the music, it's created by re-elaborating the sound of the machines. So no musical instruments, just the recordings within the factory and the recordings of my mother operating this mechanical apparatus. And having her as part of the project was in a way a bit of a gamble, because I've never had maybe the strength to be that personal. There is always a personal side in my work, but I try to keep it like maybe behind the scenes. I reveal it in a sort of like hidden way. But this project was also a project about love, and it was a project about genesis and creation. And I think it was very important to have my mom there. And definitely the project itself wouldn't have been possible without her. Yeah.
Excellent. Peter Da Silva next, please.
Well, congratulations. These are unbelievable. I can't wait to see the full video. Really exciting to see it. I'm curious if you have a point of view on the newest kind of maybe art called non-fungible tokens. Have you had a chance to think about those, and what is that? Is that art? You know, it's a unit of data that gets stored in a digital way on the blockchain. So I'd just be interested in your views on NFTs.
Yeah, I've been looking into it. I've been asked to produce some limited editions of non-fungible tokens, and I haven't so far. I have mixed feelings. To be honest, it isn't. If we want to call it art, I think we usually call art whatever people agree that it is art. So it's very difficult for me to say that it isn't. But the kind of art that I like is conceptual and asks questions. And the kind of art that I've seen coming out of the NFT speculation bubble feels very shallow to me. Seems more of a financial operation rather than an operation that really engages with culture or engages with ideas or even engages with questions. So in that sense, I feel a little skeptical. I have seen also that some financial reports that up to this point, less than the 1% who is participating in NFT is actually making money. So it seems very, a lot less democratic than the sort of like media hype is describing it. Of course, this may change, but this is so far my perspective on it.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. Yinka.
Yes, I thank you. I was actually really fascinated by the article and by your work and everything. Now, jacquard is very popular in my country as a material, and is often what you find with the men with flowing robes have made them from different types of jacquard. So that intrigued me, and I wondered whether stories are woven into the material. And linked to that is your genetic code that has been woven into jacquard. Can it be read by anybody else apart from your mother? Can anybody, I mean, are stories, is information passed through that material?
Yeah, this was a very important point. Basically, you can convert information into any kind of image. You can always do some sort of like data visualization, but it is also difficult for that visualization to be reverse engineered in order to extract the source, the original data. For this textile, I created two different softwares. A software that encoded my DNA and produced the weaving pattern. And then there is another software which I have, which can decode the weaving pattern and go back to the original genetic data. So in a way, it is technically possible, 50 or 100 years from now, to extract all of my genetic information out of this artwork, which is now part of a museum collection. So yeah, it is, the story is still there, but then of course, most people will not be able to actually read it. They will participate in it as we participate in stories and narratives, which is, the sort of like storytelling that often goes together with art production.
Okay, so theoretically, you're the only one. Theoretically, I mean, it's theoretically possible, but in reality, it's highly unlikely to be anyone but yourself who can unravel what has been put in. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Martin.
Oh, Emilio, thank you so much. This is such beautiful work. So in terms of humanity, I mean, given the fact that DNA is conserved amongst humans, 99.9% of the DNA is the same between mine and yours. It would be interesting to think about doing the same process with other people to show, you know, the relationship that we have to others, whether by race or ethnicity. Have you thought about that? And you know, would you head down that path?
Yeah, I am working on that. As part of the exhibition that opens next week, I have 2 parallel series. One is called Sections. Sections, it's basically a series of works in which I have created a different textile using a different encoding system, and then I'm framing just sections of it. And then I have another series called Samples, where I'm taking data samples from myself, and I'm using all kinds of different visualization techniques to transform it in textiles. And then I'm doing something that I'm calling genetic portraits. And these are works on commission. So I have already produced, I'm producing the first 2. And even though the exhibition has not opened yet, but people can commission the production of a portrait for themselves. And this portrait is produced using exactly the same technique that I used for my code, but instead of being created on textile, I'm working with a different material, similar to other projects that I didn't have time to show. But I'm definitely interested in the idea, and it is true that on the one hand, we all have a very, very similar genetic codes. Even, you know, my genetic code and the genetic code of a fly, they are very similar. But then what we can do artistically with the interpretation of the data can be widely different. So that actually opens up a space of incredible, you know, inventiveness and creativity. So I'm basically working with it within that space.
So thank you very much.
Mark.
Yes, hi, that was beautiful. I'm wondering how you decided on the palette to be used, given that that's the one not subjective, that's the only subjective thing.
Thank you, Mark. This is a really good question. I usually mention this during the introductions, but I forgot. So when I use a technique or a technology, I always try to push it to the breaking point. So by using this jacquard loom, I could have made a textile of, you know, even larger. But what I wanted to do was to compress the data as much as possible. So to have in a way the smallest possible textile and compress the data while keeping the possibility of going back to the origin. So going back to my code. And so by basically trying to find optimization, basically trying to find the most accurate way of translating my data without breaking the machine, because we really pushed, you know, the jacquard loom, this very old machine, almost to its breaking point. And so the size, which is around 60 centimeters, is the maximum width that that machine can operate. The length, which is a bit over 80 meters, that was the shortest possible. And then the color is dictated by the fact that those machines can operate with only 2 colors. One color creates some sort of like background, and then you have one thread that goes back and forth with the shuttle. And I used black and white, going back to the idea of the binary code and sort of like digitalization, which is always binary. And by using black and white, I could also create different shades of gray. So in the end, we have five colors, and that allowed me to maintain readability, but also compress the data as much as possible. And I'm using the same logic also with my newest textiles, which are produced with digital looms and can operate with, for example, 5 different colors. Then it means that I can compress the data more. I can have smaller textiles with the same amount of information, because this time I have more colors instead of only 2. But in any case, I'm always trying to push it to its technical limit.
Excellent. Judy?
I love your work. I love your creativity. And so I think, one of the beautiful things is you get to tell stories. So there's a story you haven't told yet. Whose voice, whose story haven't you told yet that you're waiting for the capacity, you're waiting for the software, you're waiting for the machinery. What story is what story is haunting you that you haven't told yet?
Wow, Judy, such a tough question. I bet there is one, maybe there is more than one. I think as an artist, I often make decision or I create systems that are both a way of answering questions, but also a way of diverting attention to certain topics rather than others. This is of course a personal question, so I think the answer can only be personal, but I feel like as an artist, I need to make art to really express what I think and how I think. And I kind of like tell my stories by snippets, one little piece of a time. One time it's my genetic code, and one time it's the photos that I've taken. My very first project was called The Sicilian Family, and it's about the memories that have been passed on to me from all of my relatives that I've never met. So that's another piece of me, even though it comes from the outside. And I feel like these are all stories that then become my story. But there is also something that I actually realized quite recently, that I've always thought that my story in and on itself is not that interesting. Why would people be interested in my personal story? So every time I tell a little bit of my story, I tie it together with issues that I think are relevant for society at large, that allow people to think and see things from different perspectives and maybe to understand something about themselves in the process. And so that is maybe the story that I'm not telling is the whole story, because I think it's better to tell it a little bit at a time.
Excellent. Next was Tim, I think was next.
Yes, Emilio, fascinating. Thank you for taking us to a new frontier. Your work around Google Street View and your other Google images brings up something interesting in the area of who owns what in this frontier. And Google goes and basically films the public, our streets, our buildings, and things like that. And now you've taken those which seems to be very much public domain. So you've taken these public imagery and you've made it into your art. What's your perception on who owns what in this space? Can Google make a claim that this is our intellectual property, leave it alone? What's this whole new frontier look like as far as ownership is concerned?
Thank you, Tim. Very good question. I think an informed answer goes beyond my my knowledge of the legal ramifications of my artistic choices. In general, I suppose that Google could claim ownership on all of my images. There is a watermark that says Google Street View, which is embedded within my images. And these are photos that I've been selling, and they are signed by me, and they have been in museums and in collections. And there is this very strong friction between my authorship as an artist and the authorship of the system. And I always think of it in terms of a collaboration. Like the corporations are extracting something from me all the time, and I'm extracting something from them, and I'm repurposing that for my own reasons, for my own projects, and to my own advantage. So it's a little bit like David versus Goliath sort of fight. But I think it's also interesting because it allows us to ask then important questions about how is authorship changing. And so like one project of mine that has had a bit of success, it's a film called Animal Cinema from 2017. which I put together, and the film itself, all the images were shot by animals. So I didn't shoot, there were no humans involved in the production of the images. These animals had stolen cameras that filmed something, people had found the camera and then uploaded the video on YouTube. And then I stole all of these materials and I put together as a film. And I thought that this was the most like horizontal form of collaboration between human and non-human, both non-human machines and networks, but also non-human animals like squirrels and dogs and eagles and monkeys. And I like to be in this space where things are not clear, because within that ambiguity, then we start to ask questions. And as an artist, I feel it's more important to raise questions than actually to provide answers, which may be more limiting or restrictive.
Wonderful answer. Mary, you're next.
Thanks. A really, really interesting presentation and artwork that you've done. I'm curious about your selection of Google Street Images, the mistakes that you showed. Did you automate that process? I'm kind of curious the interface between automation and human artistry. And I'd be curious how you chose and what filters you used to identify and select those images.
The answer may seem even more insane than the project itself. There was no automation. It was a very sort of manual labor. It was me virtually traveling from place to place. And I had started collecting these glitches way before I knew that this would become an artwork. Maybe this is something important to say, but I collect a lot of things. And I have these like ongoing archives, several, and every time I see something interesting that sparks my curiosity, it's in the archive. And then maybe years later, I find there is a common thread that links these things. That's exactly what happened, for example, with those glitches from Report a Problem, the first part of the Google Trilogy. I realized that they were beautiful as they were, and there was enough material to become a whole art project. And the same thing happened with the last part, the driver and the cameras, when I realized that within this massive archive of weird images, I think I had maybe 12 or 13 portraits of drivers. And because the Google car had this camera with 11 lenses, I picked 11 and I made the third part of the trilogy. And yeah, so it was not automated. I did not use any system, and I think more often than not in my work, things are still very manual, very labor intensive. Even when then the way I present them, they almost seem like the output of a very systematic process. There is a lot of like human fatigue and also human obsession behind them.
Excellent. Sandra.
A lot of your images use traditional photography and then you change them using technology. Did you start doing traditional photography and evolve into this, or was this always the way you worked? And if it's been an evolution, what caused you to move in this direction? What were you trying to say that was different?
In terms of like my artistic background, I did go to an artistic high school, but then for college and my master program and my PhD program and residencies abroad, I had a very eclectic path, doing a little bit of social studies, art theory, media studies. And so I was not trained as a photographer. I feel like my aesthetic has always been a mix of different things. I like to draw from the tradition. I have a project which is about converting the Book of Metamorphoses by Ovid into 3D sculptures. And the aesthetic of that is always, it's very linked to like Greco-Roman sculptures, for example. But I think for every project, I look for materials or shapes or techniques that get as close as possible to my idea. It's a way of finding some form of homology between content and form. So when you see a photo that has an aesthetic that it's more classical, like for example, in the documentation of the production process of the other shapes of me. I feel like that is the best way. It's black and white, as the textile is black and white. It's elegant, and it's somehow connected to the project itself. It's connected to the figure of my mother. It's connected to how we are used to document things. For Report a Problem, those images had to be different. That was the only way to convey the sort of like concept of the project. So I feel like the reason it's always based on the project itself, and it's not based on personal evolution. Depending on what the next idea will be, my aesthetic will be shifting accordingly.
Emilio, these have been such wonderful answers. I want to take us back to some of the discussion that this group was having in our earlier two sessions and get your opinion on how we might start to solve some of the issues. So this is, let's say, connects to the Google projects that you did, and your focus on places where technology was breaking or the world was broken in some way. I've always thought of art as a way of connecting us. You talk about it as, you know, connecting into our humanity and so forth, a way of connecting across differences among individuals. And we talked this morning about how do we get those who are making regulations to understand better the kinds of impacts that those regulations might have, or those that are developing new technologies, how they might have impacts on people. I always thought of art as a way of beginning a conversation, the stories that art tell, the way they connect us. Do you have thoughts on how, given what you've been doing with your art, we might be able to address some of the issues that are plaguing our society through technology today?
I think that if one thing is clear, it's that any answer will have to be a collective answer, and it will require a form of collaboration, which also means probably sharing our intelligence and working across different forms of intelligence, because there are many kinds. And so I feel artistic intelligence can definitely give a contribution. And I have done, for example, for the Amazon project, the first time I presented that was during an art fair, but I merged the presentation of the artwork with a workshop that I did in collaboration with the Italian Confederation of Young Entrepreneurs. And I put all of this, before putting the installation together, I had all of these objects on a table, and I asked them to find meaning within those objects, to put them together, to reorganize this material according to their own sensibility. And we went through different iterations of these exercises, and we worked together on how do we make sense of things that don't seem to have any clear or apparent sense. And the exercise was extremely successful because, first of all, at the end of the exercise, a lot of people said, like, I can go and look at the art in the art fair and I see it with different eyes. And I can see how people have organized things in a certain way. And of course, part of the workshop was also that of asking this question, like, how do we relate with artificial intelligence? And many of the people who were collaborating were implementing AI in their own companies. So on the one hand, they were doing it. On the other hand, they were not really sure of where AI was going, what it would really mean. So I feel like it's always important to introduce some shifts in our perspective. And then I think that it's just part of a process. Then things will evolve automatically. And the next person to really introduce a breaking point maybe will be inspired by seeing some art. I don't know. I can hope so. But yeah, I think like my contribution will always be that of creating bridges and also trying to communicate ideas that don't belong to a particular field. Like as an artist and a researcher, I feel like I always tap from different disciplines, bodies of knowledge, and then I try to turn that into a bridge that can lead somewhere else. And I feel that is always productive.
I think you're doing a fabulous job of doing that. Speaking of your Amazon project, I was curious if, no pun intended there, whether you learned anything about yourself through the things that were recommended to you for purchase.
So because I didn't want the project to reflect my past patterns of things that I'd already bought, otherwise we probably would have had like just an infinite list of books on French philosophy and something. It would have been an extremely boring installation. So I started from scratch with a completely new account. And in that sense, I wanted the algorithm to be based on what Amazon was going to suggest more than on what I had already bought. But it is influenced, for example, on the geographic area. And the suggestion will be based on that. They can probably see some information that are stored in my browser, even if maybe at the time I was using incognito mode, but there could still be cookies that they are tapping into. So I didn't discover anything that could be clearly linked to myself. But then when it came the moment of organizing those objects and putting them together, that is the question of how do we produce knowledge and form. And through that, I feel like I always discover something about me. How do I produce meaning? And I think also through experiencing my work, people can see something about me.
Excellent. Terrific. Thank you for that. Do we have other questions from the audience that you would like to ask Emilio? All right, not seeing any. We've had, oh, here we go. Thank you. Sally.
Yes, well, I've been wondering whether I should ask this question, and I guess I've decided I shall. I'm wondering what surprised you about the tapestry, or if anything surprised you about the tapestry when it was finally completed.
A lot of things surprised me in the process, more than the tapestry in itself. What surprised me was the amount of technical questions and obstacles that had to be overcome to get to the tapestry. Like, quite frankly, when I first proposed this project, it was a few years ago, and it was during a Harvard class, a graduate class for like art production. And I just started to think about these things, and I proposed the idea, and everyone said it's absolutely impossible. And even if it is impossible, it's going to be too expensive. And here we are a couple years later, and I actually did it, but it was incredibly complicated, and it was impossible to do it if I had done it just by myself. So I did mention this at the beginning, that there were a lot of partners that have collaborated with me along the way. What was surprising was maybe discovering like how well I fared in working within this environment, which is not just me and my studio, but it's like collaborators. And I made a film that was completely new. Working with photographers, working with coders who helped with the software. Like, everything was a bit of a surprise. But that's the best thing about making art, I think, that you may know where you start, but you don't know exactly where you're ending, and then it's very exciting.
Sounds very much like innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other thoughts, questions, comments from the audience? All right, so if there's nothing else, let's thank Emilio again for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I'll just remind you, so today was our focus on, as Emilio pulled us home here, the tech titans that we see today in our world and how they've used the traditional digital technologies of the last couple of decades to build incredible businesses online and had such huge impacts in where we are today. We're going to start to pull back now with our tomorrow sessions and look at artificial intelligence, machine learning, those sorts of technologies around data science and how those are starting to have huge impacts in many aspects of our world. We'll begin at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with a talk by Finale, who is going to be telling us about responsible and effective AI with insights from the healthcare industry. We'll also hear some more about issues tomorrow through government, interacting between humans and AI, and then end up in a space with a wide-ranging talk about data science. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow in my morning, your possible afternoon or evening, and I hope you had a wonderful time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
so
Mike.
much,
Thank
Emilio.
you. And Emilio.
Amazing.
Yeah. Grazie, Emilio.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you, everyone. Michael.